Okay. Hey, Martha. I see you clapping. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, everybody just please put your name, your location, and good job, Gary, for putting in the traditional home where you, the lands of the traditional people where you live. I will ask Steve, because he's from New Jersey, Tom, because he's from New York, and Heather, because you're from California, just to say hello, tell us who you are, and then we will move into just the opening. So may we go with Steve, and this is to give our presenters, Luke and Eric, a sense of their audience. So if you would please, Steve.
Okay. For Luke and Gary, huh?
Yeah. Well, you know, for everybody. For everybody, but.
Once again, I've been a climate activist for many years and trained climate reality project leader. And my wife and I usually do everything together for many years now. And we're very actively pursuing a 50% reduction by 2030 campaign, local, state, and also federal for that matter, mostly by talks and getting people lined up to support 50% reductions, and that applies to every household in the whole country. By 2030, we have 8.5 years. So that's my way that I'm saving the world.
Yep, we all got to do our part. Okay, hello, Tom. I don't believe we've met before. Welcome, Tom.
Pleased to be here. So I'm a lifelong Unitarian member of All Souls in New York City. About 20 years ago, I started funding clean tech companies and other industry startups, but I've become very involved in clean tech. So I've been looking at decarbonization of cement. So companies with alternatives to the existing Portland cement model. So I'm hoping to learn a few insights here. And I do a lot of my clean tech investing through a group called Clean Energy Venture Group out of Boston, which is an angel group. You're on mute, by the way.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Tom. Nice to meet you. And Heather.
Yeah, I'm from Oakland, California. I'm a member of the First Unitarian Church of Oakland's climate justice crew, and I know nothing about concrete and all of that, so I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome, thank you. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you everyone for joining. Secondly, this is being recorded, and it will be shared on both the Drawdown and the Strengthen Local Climate Commitment website. I will be putting those links in the chat during the presentation so as not to take time away from presentation time. We are Unitarians. We are partly organized around our, well, when we do climate activism, environmental activism, we are organized around our 7th principle, which is, and of course I'm going to blow it, respect for the interdependent web of life of which we are all a part. And we are here tonight because of 2 campaigns organized through UU Ministry for Earth, and that would be Create Climate Justice, and I will put information about that into the chat. There are 2 campaigns within that organizing framework. One is SLIC, Strengthen Local Climate Commitments, and essentially the purpose of that is to help Unitarians reach out to other organizations and denominations and just any group within their communities to encourage their local representatives to strengthen their local climate commitment plan and make sure that they do so with justice and equity as part of the foundational elements of their climate plan. And now with our new NDC, it is 100% appropriate for you to knock on your mayor's door or go to your state rep and say, dudes, women, how are we going to get to 50% by 2030? Get it in the plan and make sure there's justice and equity metrics in there. So that's the SLIC. The drawdown, many of you have heard of. It is like the 80 most effective solutions to draw the carbon in the atmosphere to the point of drawdown when the curve starts going down. And we have all been playing the game of Drawdown EcoCchallenge and accruing points by learning, by eating more climate-friendly meals, less meat, more fruits and vegetables, doing things like going out and letting our favorite grocery stores know that we want them to use climate-friendly refrigerants and any of 80 other most effective solutions. So with that, I would like to introduce Luke Kimball, who is from Pathways Unitarian in Texas. And he, as many of you know, when you sign up for Drawdown, one of the line items is, do you have any suggestions? And Luke wrote in his suggestions, put some focus on cement. And I'm like, dude, I need you to give a presentation. And so here we are. So with that, I turn it over to Luke. And just so everybody knows the timing a little bit, we are at 8:11 Eastern. So we will have about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, a little bit of time for Q&A, and wrap up by 9 and move into the rest of our evenings. Thank you so much. Welcome, Luke.
Hey, thank you, Doris. First of all, I want to thank you for putting this together. With thumbs up. I want to make sure I've got a good, clean connection. Yes. All right.
It was sketchy. It sounds better now.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm in a hotel in the Houston area. I travel quite a bit. Anyhow, my name is Luke Kimball. I am with Pathways UU Church. I'll give you a quick background. I have a degree in chemical engineering. I have an MBA. I've spent the bulk of my career in product development, business development, material development, technology development. And I'm going to tell you, I work for CarbonCure now, and this is one of the most interesting positions, most interesting companies I've been with. I've been in the plastic industry, the semiconductor industry. I've been in the concrete industry for the last 15 years. I am a member of Pathways UU Church in Hurst, Texas. That's in the DFW Metroplex. I just say I stumbled in there 5 years ago looking for a place to go to church on Sunday, and I really fell in love with the UU church, the covenant, all that. I ended up being on the board. I became the treasurer. I ended up working together with the rest of the congregation. We pulled people in. We grew our little congregation from 60 people up to about 95, and then the pandemic hit. So we're kind of holding our own here for a year plus. I really like the UU Church because it's covenant-based, and that seventh principle speaks to me, the respect of our interdependent web of life. And I fully support that. I believe that we all are interconnected, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from an interpersonal standpoint, we're all connected to each other. So what I want to do is start with a reading, then I'm going to turn this over to Eric. This reading is called The Task of the Religious Community. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. A religious community is essential. For alone, our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen. and our strength is too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. And that was from Mark Morrison Reed, a fellow UU. With that, I'll turn this back over to Doris.
And I will immediately turn it over to Eric. And let's make sure, Eric, that you have all the connections you need to do your slide. There you go. I see it.
Excellent. So yeah, first off, thank you, Doris, for the invitation and for having me here to talk about an issue near and dear to our hearts, Luke and I, which is the issue around the concrete industry. So this will take about 30 minutes or so. I'll try to be good with time, so we have plenty of time for discussion. I'm going to cover a lot, so this will probably prompt some questions for you. But I'm sure by the end of this, I hope at least that you'll be as excited about this topic as we are and understand kind of the level of issue that this is. So before we get into the details, I did want to set the stage here in terms of what I'm going to talk about. And so when we think about climate, when we think about emissions, we often are really thinking about what we would call operational emissions. So your utility bills, emissions coming from the burning of fossil fuels, those sorts of things have really kind of been the dominant part of the conversation for the last, several decades. One issue or one item that has not attracted nearly as much attention, but which is actually really important, is this concept of what we would call embodied carbon. And the way to think about that is it's really the industrial side of manufacturing. So as an example, if you went in and bought a new cell phone, before you ever charged that phone and therefore drew power and therefore created emissions to use that phone, there was a lot of energy that went into making that device, for glass, for electronic semiconductors, and all of that had an environmental impact. So it's the same thing when we look at construction. Before anybody actually occupies a new house, there's going to be emissions from wood, from concrete, from steel, from glass, whatever materials went into that. So as I talk about this today, just think about that it's really talking about, not things that you're using, but things that are being used to construct something. And when you look at global emissions, and you talked about those 80 key strategies, when you look at the actual pie slice of where emissions come from in any given year, it might surprise you to find out that as much as 10 or 11% of all emissions on any annual basis are coming from just purely the manufacturing of construction materials. So steel, concrete, glass, plastic, wood, all of that industry of making new living spaces is as much as 10 or 11% of all emissions in any given year. So it's quite high. And it's also, again, probably the pie slice you hear the least about. You usually hear about electric vehicles, you hear about solar energy, you hear about industrial emissions and oil and gas, but you probably didn't know, that we talk about steel and concrete and issues like that it's a pretty large percentage of the pie. Additionally, as many of you will know, in some of the cities I heard you rhyming off of Dallas and Fort Worth and all of those places, that we have seen a lot of construction, and we're going to keep seeing more construction as time goes on. So there's an estimate out that we're going to be seeing basically the equivalent of New York City be constructed in new buildings every month for the next 40 years across the globe. So as somebody who is, very environmentally minded, that is distressing for a lot of reasons. But also what you can imagine is that as we have a growing population and we have more people living in cities, that means that a lot of this construction is going to not be single family homes, it's going to be multi-story towers. And as part of that, getting down to the real topic of tonight, which is the concrete and cement world, you may not actually know this, but concrete and cement is the most abundant man-made material anywhere on the planet. So after water, you are most likely to encounter concrete wherever you go around the world. And we don't really think about it a lot because it is kind of in the background of our lives. If you walk down the street, if you actually start to look around and pay attention to what's there, the majority of the built environment is concrete. It's sidewalks, it's parking lots, it is buildings, it is dams, it is highways. And part of that is just that concrete is really a fantastic material and you can make it anywhere because all you need is some rocks, some cement, and some water and you're good to go. And that makes it really popular and it makes it really effective. But as a result of that popularity, it makes up about 7% of annual emissions in and of itself. And for any given building, it is probably the largest or second largest contributor of materials-based emissions. The only exception to that would obviously be like a single family home, which is typically wood-based. So how is concrete made? Well, we go out into the environment and we dig up limestone deposits typically. And so you see those open kind of pit type mines where they are basically digging these deposits out of the earth. And the limestone itself actually is, traditionally or historically, it is living matter that's been compressed. And so you're looking at limestone, which has a chemical equation of calcium carbonate, and we dig all of that up. That ends up going to a cement processing facility or a cement kiln. So if you've ever driven by one of these, they're typically really long, tall towers that have a bunch of conveyor belts around them. And they're typically always associated with this giant plume of smoke coming out of them. And that is where limestone material, that rock material, is being heated up, and it's basically, burning it under pressure, and that releases CO2. Once you have cement, then you can make concrete. So one easy analogy here, if you've not spent much time thinking about concrete, is that you can think of it a lot like a cake. So there are many different kinds of cakes you can make. There are many different kinds of concrete. And the key ingredient, however, is always the same. And that ingredient in our case with concrete, that ingredient is cement. So you need cement for all types of concrete, but you can have many different types of concrete. So that's typically where we're most familiar with it, is those concrete trucks you would see driving on the road. And once you have the concrete there, you can then build whatever you're looking to build with that product. So concrete is actually made up of mostly rock, sand, gravel, quarried stone, things like that. This image is showing you the breakdown of what goes into concrete production. And as you can see here, about 60 to 75% is just basically inert, crushed up stone. 10 to 15% is the cement, or that active ingredient. And then about another 14 to 20% is water. And there's a small amount of air that's in there as well. However, when you compare that to the actual environmental impact of the materials, about 90% of the emissions impact of concrete is actually coming from that small slice of cement. That 10 to 15% of the mass is 90% of the overall impact. So that means that if you really want to understand issues around decarbonizing this material, you're really talking about decarbonizing cement, since it's such a majority of the emissions in the product. And that's just restated there. This is the process, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but as you can see, this is the process of making that product. It is very industrial. It requires a lot of mechanical labor, and it creates a lot of emissions, and it goes through a number of different steps in order to get to the end product. So it is not that simple. It is complicated, but it also, you can see here, has a number of steps involved. So now getting to the key challenge with this sector, which is, why can't we just solve our emissions problem with something like cement, like we've started to solve for other industries? And one of the key challenges in this sector, which doesn't exist for other sectors, is that you really can't just change your power source and hope for that will solve the problem. So if you in your own home choose to install solar panels or choose to install wind turbines or other sources of renewable energy, and you then electrify everything in your house so that it's all running off of that power, you could get to a fairly low impact pretty quickly. Unfortunately, for the cement production industry, that's not really possible. And the reason for that is twofold. The first is that in order to actually heat up that limestone, you need a lot of energy, which typically comes from fossil fuels. And then secondly, as you can see on this graph, and for those of you that are, chemistry or biologically inclined and are used to seeing these equations, what it's showing you is that when cement is heated under pressure, the molecules that make up that product are effectively split in half. And what you end up with is calcium oxide, which is also known as lime. And then you get CO2. And that CO2 is just pumped directly into the atmosphere during the production phase. So even if you ran all of this process on green electricity, you would still always be producing CO2 from the process itself. So that's a key thing to understand. Much like oil and gas refining, when you make the product, you are invariably creating CO2. And when it comes to cement, what that means is that for every pound, every ton of cement that you make, you're typically making about 0.9 tons of CO2 at the same time. So almost a pound for pound equivalent. So for every pound or every ton of cement that you buy or that you lead to being purchased because of the buildings you design or choose to build, you're creating that impact into the environment just from the material itself. And again, once you have cement, you can make concrete. Unfortunately, also, so that makes concrete sound very bad. It makes it sound not so great. It makes it sound like it has a lot of problems. Unfortunately, this is not just a matter or a question of switching from one material to another. You cannot replace concrete and cement just with timber or just with steel. There are a lot of reasons for that, and one of them should be pretty obvious, which is that you're probably not going to walk on a steel sidewalk. You're probably not going to dam a river using wood. Concrete, just again, is pretty unique in those properties. But similarly, there's also actually not an environmental benefit in terms of some of these other materials either. So it's not a question of just swapping things out here. It's looking at, we need to do something about all of our industries. And you mentioned those 80 kind of strategies. There's probably hundreds or thousands of strategies we have to do across our entire economy in order to decarbonize. And I'm just talking about concrete and cement here, but there's obviously other issues or strategies for other industries as well. This is really technical, so I'm not going to spend much time on it other than just to show you that this is a typical concrete mix. And again, you're seeing that most of the mix is made up of rock, sand, and gravel, which is called aggregates here. And then the minority is that cement product, and there's some water in there. But the key thing is the second bullet on the left, again, showing you that for every, this is in metric units, cubic meter of concrete, you're looking at about 393 kilograms of CO2. So it makes a lot. It's a big impact. That's affected by all sorts of things. So if you are buying concrete just for your backyard, that's going to have a lower impact than concrete you would use to build a 20-story building. So it's not actually very easy to just kind of estimate an average for all different concrete products. They all have different impacts. It depends on a lot of factors like where you buy things from, what your local power grid is like, what types of technologies are being used to make that concrete, where those materials came from. So just be aware of that there's lots of different influences on that actual number. So I'm going to start veering more towards kind of the policy or the what can we do about this issue topic here pretty shortly. But the first thing I'm going to point out here is that, until tonight, did you ever think about low carbon concrete? Or did you ever think about the carbon impact of concrete at all? My assumption, Doris is nodding, I know she has, but my assumption is for many of you, you've likely never thought too deeply about this topic. And if I were to ask you, what is low carbon concrete? Or what is a lower carbon option that is out there? Would you have any idea what that is? My guess is very likely no, right? And that's not uncommon. I mean, my parents still refer to those trucks as cement trucks, which is very wrong, but it's very common. It's not, again, something we spend a lot of time thinking about. But I would also point out to you that until a couple of years ago, if you went to the grocery store and you wanted to know which type of milk is healthier for me, which type of milk has a better environmental footprint, would you have had any way to do that either? And until very recently, the answer to that question was also no. Now, as you know, if you go to the grocery store, you can look at different products and you can find out from the information labels on the back how many calories they have in them, how much sugar, whether they are oat milk or soy milk or whole milk or skim milk or whatever. There's a bunch of information there for you to make a choice for your own personal benefit. A similar movement is underway in these building construction materials categories. And the product that is most commonly used in this industry is something called environmental product declarations. And what they are meant to do is to calculate the impact of making that material and to help you understand what that impact on the world has been from using it. And in this case, what you're seeing here is information associated with a cubic yard of concrete, where they're showing you how much energy needed to be consumed in order to make that product. And they're showing you how much CO2 was produced as a result of it, which is shown as global warming potential. You can also see, knowing that you have interest in other aspects of ecosystems and biodiversity, that there are other negative impacts from a product like concrete, like eutrophication, ozone, smog, other things that affect human health. And unfortunately, much to the topic of how this was introduced, is that heavy industry tends to be located in places of lower socioeconomic status. And that tends to also have a very negative impact on the health of people living there. And there are, of course, also, various environmental justice aspects to that, because as we know, putting industry close to residences is not something that is beneficial for anybody. But unfortunately, there's a long history and pattern, especially in the Western world, of doing that. So when you look at these impacts, keep that in mind as well. In addition to a climate impact, we're also talking about a human health impact. We're talking about a quality of life impact, and we're talking about just a general ecosystem impact as well. So why do we use concrete, and what drives that consumption? So the two biggest things that affect how much concrete we use in any given year are new housing construction and government infrastructure. And this is where it gets really interesting, because if you look at concrete as a product, government actually buys directly or indirectly about 40% of all concrete. And the government is actually the single largest purchaser of these products pretty much anywhere. So if you really want to change this industry, I hope what you can understand from this is that that means that we have to really do something as a society, as a culture, as talking about our elected officials and directing them to this issue. You cannot, as an individual, go out and change this industry by asking for better products. What we really need here is a decision, a choice from the actual overall civil society to do something different. And what we do know is that when governments do act in this area, it has an immediate impact because, again, you cannot afford to alienate your biggest customers. So pressure for more sustainable choices and climate-friendly choices in this industry are going to really have an effect if they come from the government. And what some work that's been done here already is showing, and this is a study coming from Portland, Oregon, and you can see here that they're finding that you can actually find strategies to reduce an impact of these products by as much as 30% without costing the public a single penny. And this is, again, a pretty low-hanging fruit item that you can actually do this in a way that is affordable and that does not have negative impacts. And all it takes is some intentional thinking and some political pressure. So knowing that impact and knowing where things stand, what can we actually do to decarbonize the product? And Luke spoke a little bit about technology and his experience. And I think one thing that you should keep an eye on over the next couple of years is that this industry is going to undergo a fairly rapid transformation. And it's being driven by the evolution of technology, and it's being driven by pressure from the climate side of the equation to do something better. So I'm going to go through a couple of things and strategies here. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but I wanted to give you a sense. And I heard one of you saying you're an investor in this space. So hopefully this is helpful to you from that perspective as well in terms of where this industry needs to go. But when you look at overall decarbonization targets for the year 2050, for this industry to achieve the decarbonization required, there's basically 4 strategies that could be used to do that. These are very technical and their names probably won't mean too much to you up front, but I'll direct you to the ones at the bottom first, which are what you see as thermal energy and fuel switching. All that basically means is using more efficient means of production and using greener sources of energy to produce that material. So again, switching away from fossil fuels and then also just making your product more efficiently. As you can see by the size of those bars, they're actually quite tiny in terms of impact versus the overall problem at hand. And again, as I was telling you, is that production issue that a lot of CO2 is made when you make cement, that's one of the problems that is unique to this industry. The 2 strategies shown in orange are the more influential ones. And this is where it gets interesting because those 2 strategies don't exist in other industries. One of them on the second one down, you're going to see that called as clinker to cement ratio. The easy way to think about that is that there are materials that act like cement, but which don't have the same impact as cement. And the way I think of that one is kind of like the Splenda of the concrete world. It's like, I like sugar. I like things that have sugar in them, but I don't like what it does to me. So what I can do is I can have this synthetic version that tastes the same, acts the same, but doesn't make me, at risk of illness or that sort of thing. It's the same thing in concrete, is that this version of cement is basically kind of like a filler that doesn't have the same negative effects. The top one is the one that Luke and I spend most of our time thinking about, which is what we would call carbon capture and utilization. And that's the idea that we can actually take CO2, which we know is problematic and harmful, and actually use it to make products that we value as a society. So that's a key thing I hope you take away from this presentation, is that, for the longest time, for as long as I've been alive, at least, the conversation has been around, CO2 is waste, it is garbage. We don't like it, but there's also no value to it. So why would we bother trying to capture it or do something with it? Basically, if we want to do efforts to fight climate change, that's just going to be a net cost to business, and that's viewed very negatively. What's starting to happen in the concrete and cement world is that there's actually a lot of evidence that they can take CO2 as a product and use it as an ingredient in manufacturing. And that makes it have some value. And that could hopefully use economic forces to actually drive that reduction in the industry. So looking at each of those strategies in succession here, the first one of fuel switching is basically just switching away from coal towards things like biomass. And in Europe, we know that cement kilns are already able to change about 30 to 40% of their fuel sources away from coal and towards more renewable sources of energy. In North America, we're at less than half of what Europe has done. So again, there is a precedent there that could be copied in North America. There are also other options for cement. There's a kind that's called Portland limestone, which basically uses other filler as well to reduce the carbon impact by about 10%. So that's one strategy. The other strategy you might hear about is basically, again, that kind of Splenda strategy, I would call it, which is finding alternatives to cement. And what you can see here is that there are materials that have chemical properties that act a lot like cement. So things like fly ash, which is a waste debris from coal plants, which normally is just buried underground, that can actually have cement-like properties, and it's used very commonly. There's other materials that are wastes from silicon manufacturing and wastes from steel manufacturing. And also, kind of really interestingly, there's this one here you can see called waste glass. That's actually ground up glass bottles that are coming from recycling facilities. So you can actually take this ground glass, it's a very fine powder, and also put that into concrete if it can't be recycled any other way. So all of those things offer opportunity. If you go back way in time, you think of like ancient Rome, their concrete that they used to build things like aqueducts was actually coming from like volcanic soil. It's coming from different materials that are naturally found in the environment. And so you can also find those things and use them to some extent as well. And we know that concrete, again, has been around more than 2,000 years, using basically the same process all that whole time. So those are just some other alternatives that could exist, and that it's going to be a really important part of the puzzle. When you look at the impact of that, and again, this is fairly scientific, but you can see here on the left-hand side, you're seeing for typical concrete that you might see used on a residential basis, the average impact on the environment is something like 300 to 500 kilograms of CO2. When you look on the right-hand side, you're seeing increasing percentages of replacements of cement, and you're seeing those numbers decline pretty substantially. So that's just showing you, again, kind of the scientific proof that that does have a beneficial impact. So looking at this kind of carbon capture, utilization, storage idea, what does that actually mean? And for those of you in Texas, you might be more familiar with this because you often hear about this from the oil and gas industry, where they talk about just basically capturing CO2 and pumping it underground into these storage aquifers where they just hope or model that it's never going to come out again. That's one way to think about this, but the other way, again, is if we can capture CO2 before it enters the atmosphere, we could do other things with it where it would be beneficial. And the ones on the top right, you're seeing there are actually uses of CO2 where you can use them to make synthetic fuels. You can use them to make fertilizers for crops. You can use them to actually grow things like algae, which can be used for other feed sources for other agricultural purposes. And for us in this conversation, it can actually also be used to make concrete. And that's the really cool thing, is that you can actually take CO2 from industrial sources where you can't find a way to eliminate it any other way, and you can take it and add it to concrete and actually make concrete that way. So all that being said, where does the public sector play a role, and how can we all as individuals influence how that decarbonization of this industry can happen? Again, like if we're talking 7% of annual emissions from one industry, we need to do something about that, and we need to do it pretty quickly. And so there is a role for this to play. And Doris at the beginning highlighted some specific members from specific states that we're looking at. And the reason for that is that, fortunately, this conversation is already starting to play out. And so if you are somebody who lives in New York or New Jersey or California or Colorado, your representatives have actually already proposed legislation that is specific to the idea of low carbon concrete materials. Some of them I'm going to list here towards the end of the presentation. So if you are members of those states, I'd encourage you to take a look at that legislation and consider talking to your representatives about it, just again, because they need to understand that there is interest in this issue. But what you're starting to see is that the spotlight is starting to shine onto this industry, and they're starting to be under some significant pressure from elected officials to do something different. And specifically in New York and New Jersey, the efforts are most advanced. And what those states are doing is they are asking, or they are directing their state agencies to require lower carbon concrete for use on public projects. So when the Department of Transportation builds a bridge in the future, they're going to be forced to preferentially choose lower carbon sources of materials. And that's really exciting because, again, if the government is controlling at least 40% of procurement of this material, they will single-handedly change the reality of the industry overnight in those states when those rules come into place. So when you look at policy in this sector, what are the things that matter? There's really only 3 things that matter that are likely going to trigger a change in this industry. The first one is really boring, and it's just, regulations. Regulations everybody hates. They're awful. They are lawyers. They are accountants. It's all of like that really nitpickety stuff. But of course, in this industry as well, there are regulations that are a problem that need to be changed. Secondly, is this idea of transparency and disclosure. And that basically goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of how much carbon is in the product. Do you even know? Do we know where we are at today in terms of the baseline for that? We can never make progress if we don't even know where our starting point is. And so we need to start there and understand what impact we are creating. And the way I think of it also is that since the public sector is driving this industry, all of us as taxpayers are indirectly responsible for the lack of choice here. Like if we do not pressure our representatives to do something about this, we are all indirectly leading to this situation, and it's not really beneficial for anybody. The final item is a really interesting one, and I hope that this is a model that you will see in other industries as well, which is what I'm going to call climate competition, and I'll explain that here in a moment. But regulatory reform, again, I don't want to dwell on this, but basically whenever concrete is purchased by the public sector, it's like going back to that cake analogy. It's like if I went down to the bakery and I said, I want to buy a chocolate cake, and I give them the recipe that I hand wrote myself. And I said, I want you to make me this cake and do not make any changes to it whatsoever. And I want this cake and give it to me. That's what I want. That is how the public sector thinks about concrete. So when they go out to the industry, they say, make me concrete, make it this way and put this much cement in it. And that's exactly what I want. And if you vary from that, not only will I be unhappy, I will actually also probably sue you. So that's a problem because those standards are very backward looking because they're based on engineering kind of data from the last 40, 50 years. Some of these standards have not been rewritten since the 1980s. So, they're very static. They do not actually consider climate, and they don't also consider technology or innovations that have happened since that was written. So that's a big issue, boring, but it does exist as a problem. The second one, again, is this transparency issue, which is that if we don't actually require the public sector to track and report how much impact they are having by buying materials, then there's no way for it to possibly improve. And so the purpose of this really is, again, to understand what is the baseline of the impact of construction materials and where will we go forward from that and how will we do better. And again, it's about normalizing this culture where that climate matters when you buy things rather than just thinking about it in terms of low cost. So just as all of us are thinking about things like, do you want to buy a product just because it's cheap? Or do you want to buy a product because it has some social good as part of that? This is the same concept, is that we need to understand the other impacts that affect our decision-making for purchasing. The final one is the most complicated of all, and I don't want to, again, dwell on this too much, but the concept here is basically, if I know there are better products out there, and I know that they have value that goes beyond just financial value, I should probably find a way to factor that into my decision-making for purchasing. So the model that New Jersey and New York have proposed effectively gives concrete producers who offer lower carbon products an advantage in the selection process for state government projects. So think of it this way, is that if I went into this bidding process, or I wanted to supply concrete to build a bridge in New York City, and Doris is my competitor, and she has a lower carbon product than I do, and we're offering the same performance capability, but her product has lower impact on carbon, she would receive a discount on the price that she quotes. So if she quoted a price of $100 and I quoted a price of $98, under what New Jersey has proposed, her bid would be considered to actually be valued at $95 and therefore would be considered the best value for the government. And then her bid would be selected over mine. So that's really this is getting really technical, but the key thing here to understand is that it gives an advantage to people who have actually done something to improve the performance of their product from a climate perspective. So again, I did say I would cite some examples. So for those of you in New York, the legislation that's been proposed is listed here. The sponsors are also listed for each piece of legislation. If you want to know more about any of these, I'd be happy to share those files with you and share the context for those sponsors. But each of these assembly members and senators is proposing legislation, again, that could be active very shortly that would actually drive innovation in this sector. So they're all listed there. And again, if anyone has any questions on that, I'm happy to dig into those specifically. So a couple of final thoughts I wanted to leave you with, and basically it's kind of like, why now? You know, like, why should this matter to you? Why is it, where does it rank on the scale of importance of issues? Well, the importance of this issue actually just rocketed up the charts pretty quickly. And that happened basically on November 3rd, when now we have a new administration that is talking about infrastructure investment in order to stimulate the economy. And so that is, you know, in classic Washington, D.C. fashion, has been called the American Jobs Plan, because I guess they think that's really marketable. But they're talking about spending as much as $2 trillion on infrastructure. And when you hear the word infrastructure, what you're really hearing is steel, concrete, cement, you know, that kind of stuff is what we're talking about. Infrastructure isn't just jobs or this kind of like hypothetical. It's mostly just stuff we put into the ground. And so when you think about that, if you think about the scale of this investment we're talking about, there's numbers out there like one here I'm showing on the slide where that level of investment could mean as much as 180 million tons of CO2 being generated just from the steel that's going to be required to build the projects that are being proposed. So we could be in the process of dialing back progress made on CO2 reduction through the process of infrastructure investment. And that's not to say that infrastructure investment isn't necessary or important. It absolutely is. And we have not been doing a good job of maintaining our infrastructure. So this is by no means a bad idea. It's a fantastic idea. But I think the key thing here is when you hear the phrase build back better, that doesn't just mean doing more infrastructure or like fixing things that are a problem. We need to think about building back truly better, which means building back differently and making different choices about how we actually choose to do this. If we just go with the standard status quo, then we are going to be locking in millions of tons of emissions that we're not going to be able to get back anytime soon. So keep that in mind. And I think that to Doris's point, this is a key time in this whole conversation because this level of investment only comes up once in a generation. And we don't have a lot of time to actually change the trajectory of that. And that's really important. I will say that at the federal government level, the administration in the US is thinking about this issue, and they have actually put forward probably the most comprehensive and scientifically based approach to managing climate as part of the economy that has yet been proposed in the US. So it's on the radar, but again, you know, it's something that always needs some airtime. So all that being said, I'm going to stop there. I hope I didn't hit you too hard with a lot of different concepts. I did see there was a lot of text messages coming through the chat. So I'm happy to end there, Doris, and move over to some Q&A here.
Thank you, Eric. Awesome. You have taken a very complex subject and turned it into something very understandable. And I so appreciate that. And I love the Splenda example. That's just excellent. All right, so I'm trying to switch the view. And it's not switching, but that's fine. So let's see, we have about 12 minutes before the hour. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to take right of the facilitator, and I'm just going to throw out all my stuff, and you can answer it as other questions come through. So, I want to comment on the infrastructure bill you use for social justice. I'm one of the people that brings your letters when we could to the to your state and Senate representatives. So you will be hearing from UUSJ. We will be lobbying and advocating for smarter things in the infrastructure bill. This is one of them. Stay tuned and please participate. And when we go out and visit your representatives, join us on those Zoom calls. They want to hear from you, the constituents. And I will say that on the Republican side of the aisle, we've been talking about low carbon cement for at least 2 years with them related to the infrastructure bill. You know, it's always been infrastructure week during the Trump administration. And they light up the Republican side of the aisle and are very interested whenever we talk about low carbon cement, because it's like, whoa, I can build and be good for the environment. I'm all in for that. So keep that in mind. That's number one. Number two, there was some, Luke had mentioned some city resolutions that he was having luck passing in Texas. So I would love to have you share about that, and even send us a copy so I can put it out to my whole list, because we're all about passing resolutions in our cities. So that's another thing. Lastly, I do have little gifts, little thank you gifts for Luke and Eric. And those are lapel pins with the Sustainable Development Goal colorful pinwheel on there. So Luke and Eric, please send me your physical address and you will get a thank you gift. All right, with that. All right, I am looking for questions.
I do see there's some in the chat, and I'd be happy
Okay.
to address those.
Yeah, please go for it. And just so people know the flow, we'll take about 10 minutes on the Q&A, see how that goes, and then we will turn it back over to Luke to wrap up with closing words, and look in the chat for some of the links that I'm sharing related to some of the campaigns that I've been describing off and on. Thank you. Go for it, Eric. And
Sure.
hey, you've been awesome.
Thank you. So Leanne, I see you have a question asking about how the 30% reduction for sidewalks was achieved. And the answer to that is really that the sad thing in the concrete space is that many of these technologies and solutions exist, but the cities and the public sector are behind. And so frankly, all they did was they went with things that were market available. And because they were not, again, these were not cutting edge, these were things that have been around for some time. They found they could do it at no cost because the industry was actually already ahead of them.
Was it materials or was it how they construct the sidewalk?
Yeah, so it was what the city found was that it was actually asking for too much cement. So they actually cut back on what they used. And they were also using replacements like slag into the mix of the concrete to replace the cement. And they also looked at using CO2 as well in that process. So Doris also mentioned some city resolutions. So Portland is one of the more advanced. The city of Austin in Texas is also another. And Honolulu and Hawaii have been the kind of pioneering ones on this topic. I see another question here coming about Alabama Power selling its coal ash. Yeah, so I mean, one of the problems with coal ash, right, is like, okay, so it's low carbon in the sense that it's basically a waste material, but to make it, we had to burn coal. And so that's not really a sustainable solution, and it's not really very good overall. What happens in the coal industry is, yes, they do basically kind of collect their ash and they would sell it to concrete manufacturers who would then choose to use it for their production. What we do know is that the industry is going to run out of that product as we shut coal plants down. And that's a good thing. I think we can all be happy about that. But what it does mean is that even one of the rare options for decarbonizing concrete is going to disappear eventually as coal plants close. And we're starting already to see supply interruptions of that material just because every year coal plants go offline and therefore there's no more of that material available.
So there's a question from a fellow Canadian. No, none of us have noticed your about accent, Eric. None of us have noticed that. So from your fellow Canadian, Martha, do you want to pose your question, Martha?
Yes. So with the lower carbon concrete / cement,
is there any change in any of the performance characteristics of it as a material? In particular, any difference in ability to manage heat shifts within a building? I'm thinking of air conditioning need, insulation capacities. Are there any changes in these thermal properties, I guess, of low carbon concrete materials? Do you see what I'm getting at here?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the interaction between the energy put into atmospheric management within the building vis-a-vis the changes in the concrete material itself.
Yeah, great question, and I think shows a lot of understanding of the topic. So thank you for asking that. The answer is no, there is no real difference to those thermal properties. One of the things about concrete that gives it that great property is basically kind of the density of the material and that it's very airtight. And all the lower carbon concrete options maintain that performance. So they would also similarly keep cold areas cold and warm areas warm. And that is one of the things the concrete industry will say is they say, well, you know, our product might have a high carbon impact, but it's also great for insulation and it's great for all these other reasons. And that's entirely correct.
Okay.
So that's important point. So the short answer is no, there's no real difference.
Okay.
There are some other property differences. So some of those materials that are fillers, you can't color concrete the same way, or they might have a slower set time or construction time. So if you're building a really tall building, that's problematic because it could cost you more money.
Right.
But from a performance perspective, no, they're pretty much equivalent.
Okay, thank you. Anne Erling from Albany, would you like to pose your question, or would you like to pose your question in person?
I've got somebody practicing in the background. I don't know if you can hear me so well, but I'm wondering if biochar is, I've heard that biochar can be used as a filler. I'm wondering if that's already happening, and possibly in, the same kind of properties possibly as fly ash.
Well, it sounds like you have a talented performer in the background anyway, so that was nice to hear. Yes, the answer to that is yes. That is one of the other materials that is being investigated. It is not available at kind of a mass scale yet, but that is another product that is being investigated. So again, I think in the next couple of years, you'll see a lot of these things that right now are kind of small become more prevalent as these other sources of materials disappear.
That is awesome to hear. And by the way, plugging our Drawdown climate action presentations, we did have a presentation on biochar, and we were looking for all the different ways that the biochar product could be used. So that's really great to hear. And I know that Gary's excited to hear that too, right, Gary? Next is Sally. Would you like to pose your question? And Sally comes to us from Iowa, and she is one of our state climate action network chairs, not only in Iowa, but also she's on the board for our state action networks for the whole country. So Sally, roll with this and do great things. And she did not hear about Iowa being the cement capital of the US. So fill her in on that too. You've joined us after we had that discussion. Go ahead, Sally.
No, I missed something. Oh, well, I had trouble with the code to get in. I don't know, it didn't work at first. So my question is, are they recycling concrete as in like for road construction?
Yes, so that does happen. Unfortunately, it's mostly just used as a fill. So when they excavate areas to put roadways in, they often use that kind of crushed rubble of concrete just as kind of filler before they put fresh concrete on top. One of the problems with reusing or recycling concrete is that when you break it down, it doesn't really have consistent properties. So again, if I go back to that cake example, right? If you kind of make a fresh cake with all the new ingredients, it's predictable, it has the same consistency. If you take the crumbs of 100 different cakes and mash them together again, they don't really have the same properties anymore. And that's one of the issues. So again, if you wanted to build a tower, or you wanted to build a wall, it's very hard when you would have big chunks of kind of, like half finished concrete just stuck in there. So that's one of the challenges with that. That's the case today. There may be new technologies that would help us reuse that, make it a full closed loop into the future. But for right now, it's just not possible. And unfortunately, a lot of that concrete ends up in the landfill.
So oh, go ahead, Sally.
Can you give me the short version on?
Sorry, yeah. So yes, you can reuse it now, but only for limited amounts, limited quantity, probably in the single digit percentages of the total concrete that's actually made.
So how is Iowa the capital of concrete in the world?
Iowa is known as the concrete state just because they do a lot of concrete mostly for roads, that a lot of other states do not do that. They have a lot of expertise on the topic.
Okay, more questions. And by the way, I cannot see everybody. So if you're raising your hand, I don't see you if you have another question. So speak up, we'll take one more and then we will turn it over to Luke to close us out. And Luke, when you close us out, please tell us how we can get the text that has been successful when making declarations and resolutions in your city and county. Okay.
I'm gonna make one last point before Luke, and I will stop. But I think the key thing I just wanted to leave you with is that when you put carbon dioxide in concrete, it is in there for hundreds of years. So again, if we're going to find a way to fix our climate problem, we have to do two things. One of them is we have to stop releasing emissions, but we also have to get back what we've already put in. And one of the only ways to do that is to catch CO2 and put it into some place where it can't do any harm. And the only ways you can do that is by pumping it underground or putting it in a material like concrete. So that's what's exciting to me about this, is that you're really looking at something that can be a solution for a long time. And that has a lot of opportunities. So, you know, interested to share this with you today. And again, I appreciate all of your time and the questions. And Luke, over to you.
All right, Eric, I've turned off my video because I got a bandwidth problem over here. So this should make my audio a little clearer. Hey, Eric, I just want to say thank you. It's been a while since I've heard you give a talk and I've forgotten how good you are. You're really good at this. I've heard the cake analogy before, but you definitely put icing on the cake. So I'm gonna close out. I'm just gonna I've got a reading I want to do, but before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the position I'm in, and I think we all are at this point. You know, I'm like a lot of people early in my life, man. I grew up. I want to get a job. I want to get a car. I want to get an education, get a job, get a house, get a better job, get married, have kids, do all that, and I've done all that. You know, I tell people now I'm glad I am as old as I am, because I'll be dead before the proverbial fecal matter hits the rotating airfoil. That's scientific talk for before the shit hits the fan. Anyhow, it's going to be a disaster in the future. I feel bad for my children. I've got 2 children. They don't have children yet, but they probably will at some point, and then their kids will have kids, and it's just going to be a rough life for generations beyond us. And it's unfortunate that we're leaving them with this. At this point, I kind of feel my purpose in life is to give back. And that's why I'm a member of Pathways. That's why I donate time to the Cub Scouts, to Pathways Church, to the food bank, to the homeless count that we do every year, so that I can give back something to society. And I feel like CarbonCure and the fact that we're sequestering CO2, and reducing the carbon footprint of concrete, which is a very common building material, is part of that. So I want to read something, and then this will close it out. This is by a gentleman named Drew Dellinger. It's called Hieroglyphic Stairway, and it goes like this. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? And that's it. I want to thank you all for your time and joining us.
Okay. Yeah, all I can say is Luke, Eric, every single person here tonight, and for everybody who views this in the future, it's been great. And I am so glad that we are bonded in this challenge together. So Yeah, Luke, how are we going to find out about the text for those resolutions?
You know, I'm sorry, I wrote myself a note. I'm going to send those to you. I'll get with Eric if there's anything new, but I've got the ones for Hawaii, the city of Austin, city of Portland.
Great,
They all
thank you.
they all kind of mimic each other. They all followed the wording from the Hawaii, the governor's conference. They're all very similar.
Great. And I'd like to offer the opportunity for anybody to unmute and share any thoughts or thank yous with Luke and Eric. And of course, it is after the hour and no one has any obligation to stay and hang with us, including Luke and Eric, but everybody's welcome to share whatever thoughts, comments you have. Going once.
Well, thank you from north of the border. The winds and the carbon dioxide know no national borders. We're in this together, guys.
Thank you from Iowa, where we have concrete and wind farms.
I really appreciated the religious framing from the Mark Morrison Reed quote, as well as the facts were just really clearly explained, and starting with knowing nothing about concrete and cement, and even that they're two different things. I felt like I learned a lot fast. Thanks.
I found Luke's framing, to follow up on that, very helpful, sobering, of course, but these are sobering times. And Eric, you really nailed it, made it very clear what we're dealing with, and possible, at least the low-hanging fruit is to get after our elected officials to start taking this seriously and start thinking about how to reduce just the use of concrete.
And I'll point out that Gary is our biochar enthusiast who is infecting us all with his biochar enthusiasm. All right, going once, going twice. It has been my honor to facilitate tonight. And again, thank you to Luke and Eric.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Doris, for going to Minnesota to the tribal gathering.
Yeah, actually I'm on my way, yes, to Minnesota to join the Treaty People Gathering, and very excited. But it offered, because I'm vaccinated, yay, it offers me the opportunity to stop and see about 20 of my immediate family members, because I'm from a really big family. And right now, this is my first stop in Chicago. And my sister has joined on her iPad and has been sitting quietly listening to the whole webinar and has not unmuted and embarrassed me. Even though there's no way she can embarrass me. It's all happened to me already. So, all right. Nice to see everybody. Take care.
I'll jump on that real quick.
Oh, no, not Gary. Go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, but
go ahead, Gary.
Last week, we attended the send-off of the totem pole journey from Bellingham. This is the 20th year. And if you go to our shared responsibility, you'll learn what this is all about. It's really a significant, epic nature of bringing healing and attention to places that need it. And this year's totem pole will be presented to Joe Biden and probably end up in the Smithsonian
Yes.
Museum.
Yeah, I was on a webinar about that. It's arriving in DC in like roughly the mid to the end of July. And yeah, it's already like claimed space in the Native American History Museum. So I'm really excited to
And
see that.
it's the most magnificent totem pole they've made. The House of Tears carvers outdid themselves, because this may be the last one, and it has the heart. They bring these things not because they're sacred, but to create sacred spaces for people to gather, hold ceremony, and you know, these folks really bring the heart wisdom to the
Oh,
fore.
and okay, I see Catherine. So I'm going to like raise up Catherine for our Drawdown EcoCchallenge. One of the action choices is to find alternative transportation for well, you know, for your journeys. And so Catherine is going to add like 2,000 miles to our cumulative alternative transportation total because she took a cross-country train trip instead of flying, unlike me who flew. But so I am like so thrilled that Catherine is going to be loading up that data. I keep looking for it every day, waiting for those 2,000 miles to appear.
I'll get it in there.
Awesome. All right. So again, thank you. It's why am I having such a hard time hanging up? I don't know. But again, Luke and Eric, you do not need to hang on, but it has been my pleasure and an honor. All right. Bye, you guys. Same time, same place, same Zoom next month.